The legalization of drugs in the United States. Should it be a state or federal issue? By Karen Trevino. So, the legalization of drugs in the United States has been a hot-button issue for decades. The federal government has historically adopted this aggressive, one-size-fits-all approach in response to the either influx or overuse of already illegal substances, or legal, rather. The 18th Amendment, which was passed and subsequently repealed in the 20th century, is often regarded as the first major prohibition in the United States, enforced and legislated by the federal government, and it certainly was not the last. One example of the collusion, or rather the crossing of state and federal law, would be in the case of California and some other states who have already passed medical and recreational marijuana laws, for example. The federal government, however, has remained firm in their classifying marijuana as a Schedule I controlled substance, as per the Controlled Substance Act, or CSA. The federal government does recognize that drugs like cannabis could provide an additional stream of revenue for state and local governments. However, they argue that the economic costs, including reduced productivity, increased funding on healthcare, and increased crime, could potentially outweigh those benefits. So considering the federal government's long history of failure in dealing effectively with public health crises, the decision to regulate drugs should be a matter of state and local law. Some constitutional challenges to drug legalization. Constitutional arguments for and against the legalization of drugs can be grouped into two primary categories. The first is comprised of challenges of the right of the federal government to actually regulate drugs like marijuana at all, and the backing for that is the Fifth Amendment, the First Amendment, and various other rights, privacy. That's kind of this abstract concept. It's introduced in Griswold versus Connecticut, but it's how much the government can actually interfere with freedom of expression, things like that. Some constitutional, the second category includes kind of the way the federal government has started to legislate and punish the possession of drugs. This could potentially go against the Eighth Amendment for cruel and unusual punishments. Some positive impacts of federal regulation of drugs. So there's more funding available, obviously. There's less perceived incentive to sell and distribute drugs because you go to federal prison. Some of the negative impacts is that ultimately it prompts an increased illicit sales in response to the initial drug shortage, and results in longer sentences for minors with possession of generally harmless substances. And it does create division and mistrust among the community and police. Some positive impacts: states can draw community-focused legislation that works on a case-by-case basis. Drug sales can provide an additional stream of tax revenue, and some of the negative impacts include obviously less available funding than what the federal government could provide if that was to be left to the states. Potential overuse of legalized substances. As the federal government already pointed out, this could be a decrease in economic productivity. And state governments may run into quality control and enforcement issues, some sketchy vendors, or sales to minors. Those arguing that the federal government is the best organization to handle widespread public health issues and things like the legalization of potential medications and other recreational drugs should also consider its extensive history of failure in these areas. One example is the war on drugs, spearheaded by President Richard Nixon. He continues to use policies of prohibition in a futile attempt to curb the ever-growing and versatile black market. And most people today recognize the war on drugs as benign and ultimately pointless, but the truth of the matter is 700,000 people in 2014 were in jail for marijuana students, and 50,000 to 60,000 students were denied federal financial funding because of their former convictions. So the federal government should hand all cases of drug use legislation all over the states so they can draft community-focused laws.